Okay, let's start.
Okay.
So thank you so much for joining me, Zoltan.
Thank you for the invitation.
This session, I'm recording this session for our Vasli community. My name is Zsuzsanna Szegedi. I teach at Vasli and running a small workshop, a creative workshop, and inviting different guests who share their thoughts and approaches that has relevance to our current crisis in pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And now we are all online, reflecting and responding to the crisis. I invited you to because I believe it was March 25th, around end of March, when I heard you speaking on the one of the channels, a Hungarian channel that was organized by Bankito and Aurora, right? The festival, the Quarantine Festival. And you talked about existential crisis and how psychology can be useful for understanding our pandemic and how we can understand better the structure and what's happening around us. So I thought it would be nice to speak with you and ask you about how what you do and how you find it useful. So would you introduce yourself to us?
Yes, thank you very much, Zsuzsanna. I am Zoltan Kovary. I'm a clinical psychologist and literature and linguist at the same time. And I am an associate professor at the university, Eötvös Loránd University, and Department of Clinical Psychology and Addictions. And I did my PhD in the topic of creativity and its relation to psychoanalysis and death psychology. And in recent years, my interest turned toward existential psychology and existential philosophy because I think it's a very useful framework to understand what is happening with us in a world like ours. And I can use this approach in dealing with my research topics like creativity, life historical approach to creativity called psychobiography, and also in my private practice because I am doing consultations and therapies in existential approach with young people mostly beginning their lives and dealing with problems of self-actualization and relationships. And that's why I was asked by the organizers of Bankito to talk about the existential approach to this kind of crises or limit situations or things like this, because I really think that this approach can help us to get the best out of these situations and to understand that how this kind of crises, conflicts, or limit situations can help us to understand ourselves more deeply than before. Because I think that we are living our lives in very usual, typical frameworks and conditions that we used to, for example, the standards of consumer society, and we are building our identity around consuming and status and wealth and so on and so on. And maybe it works well until the world goes well, or we believe the world goes well. But we see that development in human life is always related to conflicts which are always the part of the life cycle. After several periods, in every period we have to face normative crises or accidental crises, and these situations is always giving us questions about ourselves, that who I am, what are my most important goals in life, and how am I related to the world and others. And this kind of crisis is always doubting or questioning our typical reactions, our typical attitudes and typical thoughts. And the authors of existential philosophy and existential psychology says that somehow this kind of limit situations, when we have to face the givens of human existence, like suffering, finitude, the lack of meaning, authentic choices, and so on and so on. So we are forced to look deeper in ourselves and trying to find our personal answers to this kind of questions. So I think that in situations like this pandemic or this COVID crisis, we can react in different ways. For example,
do you think this is a good moment for us to stop? Do you think it's a good moment for us to stop and think about these different ways?
Absolutely. I think that it works on different levels. For example, I think that it's a very good situation or very proper situation for the individual to start to think about some deeper meanings in life. Also, it's a very good chance for communities and also for the entire mankind, because we know that this crisis is not independent from the ecological crisis that we have been experiencing strongly in the recent years, although it has been there for decades. And some of the experts believe that, for example, if we think about this global level, that we have to realize that we cannot continue our lives the way that we did it before the crisis. And it might help us to get some insights about the way we used to approach or we used to live our life. And just as I am not a sociologist or not a social scientist, but a psychologist, I experience it mostly on the individual level. For example, in therapies, and also by doing conversations with my students about these questions, because as for everyone, for me, it also happened that my lessons and my consultations in the university took part on online versions, and we had interesting or a bit surprising that we had to have more personal conversations with students like before, because before the crisis it was very typical that we get to the university rooms, we had the lecture or the class, and after that everyone went home. But we spent a bit more time together online with the students, and we also discussed some problems that is related to this very strange situation. And also, of course, my clients in the consultational therapy, they also talked a lot about their actual experiences concerning the crisis, which on first hand was related to some anxiety that is related to the loss of everyday framework or the loss of security feelings, or the loss of everyday bonds, everyday relationship with other people. So if we think about the basic existential fears or the basic existential anxieties, like the fear of finitude, the fear of isolation, or the fear of meaningless, or the meaning in life, it all appears in this current situation. Because on one hand, of course, according to the disease, we have the fear of losing life, losing health, and also if you think about how many people lost their jobs, it's also very critical to our wealth and of everyday living. But besides this, we also have to face isolation from other people, because most of the time we live our life connected to each other. You know, we are social animals, so we spend most of our time related to other people. And it is still very limited that who can we meet, how can we keep up our everyday identity by being connected to other people and discussing all the things we are interested in, or going out to some places that are the parts of our everyday life, like for example going to restaurants or concerts, whatever. So it seems that a lot of people lost a lot of their daily routines that kept their identity, that who they are in everyday life. And it's, for a lot of people, it's very hard, because most of the time we are not forced to think about that who we are beyond these everyday roles that we take. But if these roles are being taken away from us, maybe we have to face some emptiness or meaningless, or some unidentifiable things that we haven't identified for ourselves formally. So if we face this situation that I am isolated, I am worrying about my health, I'm worrying about the health of the people that I love, I'm worried about my future, the loss of my roles, and so on and so on, I can do two things, or maybe more than two. I can hide my head in the sand and trying to escape into hedonism or something. I watch TV, eating, drinking, and so on and so on, and I try to enjoy this situation, but it's a desperate enjoyment, I think so. Or maybe I can be super worried by focusing on the news and trying to collect as much information as it's possible. Of course, collecting information is useful on one level, but if I am becoming obsessed about this, the level of my anxiety will be raised to the skies, and that's why some symptoms can emerge. I became hypochondriac and depressed, or I'm obsessed with the questions of health. I take a lot of vitamins and so on and so on.
Is that because there's no channel there's nowhere to put all that information in action?
Yes, of course, because we have a lot of information and we cannot turn it into action, because we are locked down or shut down and cannot do anything. Just only we are looking at the internet and maybe talk to others with
How about creativity? Because there's a lot of the new high level of creativity.
Yes, yes. In some minutes ago, I tried to show that how there are some problematic reactions to these situations, like hiding my head to the sand, escaping into something hedonism, or developing neurotic symptoms. But there are other chances for me to react. This is the positive side, when the crisis is not causing disintegration or regression into some helpless conditions, but somehow I began to discover some inner sources of strength. For example, for some people, the losing of everyday routine and roles, like going to work, is not a worrying thing, but just the opposite. They start to feel free to start to deal with the things that they are really interested in. Because I think that there are a lot of creative people who cannot focus on their creative potentials and ideas, because they have to do everyday work all the time, and they are tired, and so on and so on. So these situations, maybe for some people, is starting to give them some inspiration for starting to listen to their inner voices much more, and focusing on their main interest, or start to read books again that they didn't have time for years, or listen to music or watch films. And in the end, I think that this kind of inspirations somehow deep inside of us is starting to form some ideas, and they will show them, these ideas will show themselves in new insights or dreams, or some kind of creative processes, or a new material, or new interests, for example. So I think that this kind of isolation can be also a source of some creative activity, which was not possible formerly if a person is too much have to focus on everyday work.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's interesting. And also said that your clients and students were more spending more time and connect. Do you think through these connections online have changed the dynamic between how deeply people pay attention or how they connect to the subject?
It's very diverse, because I experienced that some of my students who were very shy to speak when we were together directly in the classroom, and with, for example, chat, they began to express themselves more freely. And that's how I did have a chance to discover some talents in who did not show themselves during the regular ways formerly. So that's this is a beneficial thing of this whole process. But of course, there are some people and some students who are more active when we are together personally with each other, and this kind of relationship is not so comfortable for them, and that's why they are withdrawing. So it's also a double-sided or an ambiguous thing. Also, I experienced different things in online consultations with clients, because on first hand, I ask clients, when we move to Skype, that if they wanted to do the consultation with only audio or with video as well. So it was their choice. And some of them chose video and some of them chose audio. And there were some who began to talk about their inner experience more freely only by connecting with audio or with audio channel, because somehow it gave them so much more freedom to talk freely about themselves. You know, it was a bit similar to psychoanalysis, when the client is lying on the couch and the analyst is sitting behind the head, and the client is not watching the analyst, and it is somehow stimulating this kind of more openness in them. So I think that in some of the clients had much, so it was beneficial for them for opening up, I think so. But there were others who who insisted to do it with a video channel, but it was very strange for me, because it's very different from the regular setting that we are doing. But
also,
it's
so you're much closer, right? You have more chance to observe the
yes,
person speaking.
yes, and we have to keep eye contact constantly. And if I do not, I turn my head, it's a more direct, because when we are sitting in the consultation room, we do not sit to each other like this, but more to this way. And it's a 90-degree, you know, and it is very good, because you can keep up eye contact if you want, but if you don't, it's a very natural position, not contacting the eyes. But when you are sitting in the camera, not looking to the camera is not a natural thing. And this is one aspect, but there's also another aspect, that your own private room is coming into view, because the consultation room is a kind of a neutral place, and it is not including your own private space.
Same thing for the classrooms, actually. Very much similar.
So it might change a kind of a dynamics between two persons in a relationship. But it's very interesting that some new clients came when in the recent period, and most of them asked to start with video channel and not only with audio. So continuing a relationship with audio is much easier than starting a relationship only with audio. But in the next week, from the next week, we are returning to in the direct meeting. So the online world is fading out now, and I'm really happy for this, because it was something that we had to adapt to, but it was not so pleasant.
And you knew that it's temporary, so that helped.
Yes, it helped. Yes.
Yeah. So I'm also looking at the my notes from the lecture that you were giving, and that was in Hungarian. Otherwise, I would share it widely. You also talked about how, like, anxiety, the actual structure of anxiety, and how our mindset of anxiety is now opening up to not just the pathological problem like mental issues, but also addressing anxieties that are coming from the outside, from our environment, and how it opens up to all these things that you were mentioning, all these options. How is this, do you feel, relates to the educational environment, right? Because right now in college situations, what I'm seeing is this pandemic opened up education and almost turned it inside out, and not only the complexity of what education is made of made visible, but it got magnified, right? Like all the component of what education is made of, right? Like usually schools and institutions build up the approaches and methods over many years and a long history of what they become, right? And just education in general, right? The use of textbooks, in-person teaching, dynamics in classrooms. So all that got put under a magnifying glass within like a few days, right? So how do you see this anxiety is being present in education? Like what are your thoughts about
that? Yes, I think that this mostly worked for students who are in their final semester, because, you know, in final semester, of course, there are a lot of requirements that they have to fulfill. In psychology, for example, in the last semester of the masters, there is an institutional practice for 60 hours in an institution like a psychiatry department, and they couldn't fulfill it, or they couldn't do it. And of course, for a long time in the beginning, they were very anxious and uncertain about that, so we had to find them for something else. And in the beginning, there were some different ideas, for example, by lengthening the semester until September, which was also not good for them, or maybe there were some other ideas. And also how would they make their final exams, for example, the closing exam, and there are still some uncertainties about that. And
what goes on in their heads? Like, how does it look like? How does this anxiety looks like from the individual? Right? Like as an educator, if I want to learn about what my students going through, I mean, listening to your lecture was really helpful for me at the very beginning of the pandemic. Instead of just looking at it from my perspective, it helped me looking at from the multiple possible perspectives that students and also educators might be experiencing the anxiety from.
I think that offering them personal consultations in Skype was very helpful, because it didn't have some time limitations. Because in the regular times, I have an office hour, and they have some 10 minutes to come in to discuss the most important things, and after they go. But in this situation, this kind of consultations were a bit similar to some kind of mental hygienic.
More like therapy, right?
No, not therapy, but a bit of a consultation, because they shared their worries with me, and we began to think together that how can they find the best solution for them. And it has to be very personal. So I think that if we would verbalize or formulate some uniformed way to solve some problems, it wouldn't have been that kind of successful. But with this, by giving them a chance to discuss it personally and find a personalized solution for them, it was absolutely good. Although for me as a teacher, it was much tiring, because it took much more time, and for me it was also not easy, because my private time and my office time were merged together, and I couldn't see the end. So I think that this helped them to have a personal contact and have enough time to formulate some personal solutions for their own problems.
Do you think it also created more bonding?
Yes.
Like as
Yes.
this anxiety brings people together, both
Yes.
faculty and students?
Yes, I think that with some students who were in the need of that, our personal relationship got more closer and we spent much more time together with consultations than regularly. And I really thought that most of the time, or not most of the time, but sometimes the real aim of the consultation was not the subject matter itself, but to somehow relate to someone that they have trust in, or someone they believed who get some kind of wisdom in these situations, and they could rely on these kind of things.
So it was more of seeking out like a secure
Yes.
connection, right?
Yes.
So do you see that through bonding and these consultations, these connections, the need of connectivity is stronger than pre-pandemic? I'm just thinking because we are taking away all the platforms for connecting on a regular basis, like before. It was taken away, so something is replacing this need of connecting. So do you think that this
Yes.
this is showing sort of like a new did we learn something from this in terms of
I think so,
need?
because if there wasn't a situation like this, I don't think that it's kind of much deeper and much detailed phase of consultation would came into view. So I think that it gave me an impression that it is so, why is it so important? So formerly, I was also much more into this formalistic kind of consultation with the students, but it got more personal and more deep, and I really saw that it did really affect the quality of their work and their achievement. So I think that if we will continue teaching or education in a normal way, autumn or maybe 1 year later, I will try to keep up this kind of intensity and this kind of personal way, if it's possible, because although it was much harder, I began to enjoy this kind of co-working much more than formerly. So I really think that for me, beside that it was very hard, and for example, doing lectures online is much problem for me. It was much harder than doing the usual. But in the end, the final experience of it was very beneficial, and it really affected my attitudes towards this kind of education.
Also, what I hear from this is the meaningfulness sort of changed,
absolutely.
right? Because the connection, so the meaning was more upfront between the individual and not only on the subject. So it wasn't like a distanced subject student professor relationship, but it's closer.
It helped to, yes.
I also see this between instructors, between professors. The connection is also tighter, and also with the university, because there needs to be more connection and more decision making and relying on each other. So I'm paying attention to these dynamics also, because right now we are in the place where the fall is not decided yet. Most likely we'll be going online, but we're reserving some small chance of possibility of doing some combination, some hybrid platform. But either way, we have to think through all these positives and also like the negative effect.
And also I got more connected and stronger connected with other kind of colleagues in the university, because just as we couldn't use the library, the students, me either, there had to be a new system to be built up. For example, I consulted constantly with the leader of the library, who helped me to get some materials for the lectures and the classes, and it also build up a new way of sharing information, and it's also very useful that I formerly haven't wasn't aware of. So it's another very interesting aspect.
Yes, I'm personally, I'm enjoying the fact that we are more connected horizontally with the faculty, and I see a lot of possibility for collaboration and co-teaching, and we're already sharing materials, sharing experiences. So as we're doing this is also training, right? We are actively participating and proactively pushing this whole thing forward. And it's interesting, you mentioned about your book before. I believe it was the new trends in psychobiography. And
yes.
that it was collaborative project. Can you tell us about that? I'm very curious.
Yes, there is the colleague that I did the editor work with, Claude Helene Meyer. She is from South Africa, and we got to know about each other's work formerly, because in this South African university, there is kind of a team who are dealing with this psychobiography research, which means that it's a qualitative research form to study individuals who achieved some important things in some creative fields like arts or science. And I really think that it's not only important because of studying creativity, but it is also very useful for the psychology students to learn how to approach an individual life. And also it is also affecting them, because it is causing involvement, and they learn a lot of things about, not only about the subject, but about themselves as well. So they also do this kind of approach in South Africa, and we were somehow connected. They asked me to take a part in evaluating a thesis or something. And after that, my connection with Claude Helene got stronger a bit, and he asked me if I'm interested in putting together a new handbook-like volume in this subject, because psychobiography has in the past decades, it became more and more successful and more well-known. But the last handbook or volume was released 15 years ago. And ever since, a lot of development happened, and more people in different countries began to deal or began to use this kind of methods. And she asked me, how about collecting some material from these countries and putting this new volume together? And I said, yes, I'm very interested in. And after that, we start to look for some other colleagues who are interested in. And we were very happy that some of the modern classics in this field, who from the 80s, 90s, they were there in the renaissance of this life historical approach in creativity research. Most of them were very enthusiastic about, and they sent their material. And after that, we began to collect the chapters. And after that, we have to make a plan about the structure of the book. And after that, there was a very long period in supervising the chapters, and we divided the work. Half of them was done by her, another half was by me. And after that, we have to formalize it, or somehow giving a unique structure, not unique, universal structure.
All throughout.
Oh, yes. And after that, during this, she started to connect with some publishers. And in the end, Springer was interested in, and it was also a very long period because they had some requirements about the formal things, which was very hard to fulfill. But it was not them who did this, but they asked us to do this. So we had to find someone who can do it. And it took, in the end, it took, I think, 1 year to put this whole thing together. And I didn't have time and energy to do any kind of other creative things beside this. So.
So you said this book took you a year, about a year.
Yes.
To complete, and from the beginning, it came out from collaboration with a colleague of yours in South Africa, right? In the South African University, is that what?
I cannot recall the name of the university, but Claude Helene at the time was having a scholarship somewhere in Germany, I think so. So she was not there, but it is her original. Yes. So.
And then it entailed collecting the works of other colleagues working in the
biography. Yes.
And
yes.
And then the book brings together different case studies. Could you tell us about like what the little bit why biography is important in your field? And also I teach in art department, so the creative aspect and looking at individual a unique individual based on the way of thinking and they, I guess, creative work, right? Because you said they were artists and different.
Yes, the book also contains a lot of methodological chapters, and about the epistemological background, about the particular methods and its relation to phenomenology, hermeneutics, and other things. Also about some practical steps, how to conduct this kind of research. And in the second part of the book, there are some case studies, of course, for example, very diverse, like Johann Sebastian Bach and Jean-Paul Sartre, to South African activists, and for example, Dostoevsky or a Holocaust survivor. So it's very diverse. And I think that psychobiography is not replacing aesthetic approach to this kind of products, or so it is not looking for the ultimate meaning of of a particular artist or work, but it is somehow help us to understand the context that really supported these these things coming into being. And I think that we are always working this kind of personal context when we are trying to understand works of art and creative lives. But psychobiography help us to understand how to do it systematically and in a professional way. So on one hand, psychobiography is an idiographic approach to creativity research, which means that we are focusing on one person or some persons or their relationship between them, and so on and so on. So on one hand, it helps us to understand how these kind of creative works related to some psychological factors, like the personality of the artist, the important relationships, crises, conflicts, peak experiences, and so on and so on, and their development. On second hand, it helps us to understand creativity in general, because after a bit similar to the work of the psychologist, that after working with a lot of individuals, you get something together in your head that how to approach an individual. It does not mean that you are using a schematic approach to all of them, but you will have a routine by how to grab the individual and unique things in life that somehow is the essence of somebody's life. So on second, it is help us to understand creativity in general, how it is embedded into one person's life. And on the third level, it helps us to understand the human mind, because not the creative, but human life and human mind, because I think that creativity is human mind at its best. So if we understand how people can be creative in different situations and conditions, it will also help us to understand how people can get the best out of life situations like this in the COVID situations. So I think that our creativity is always in the focus when we have life situations, and the artists and the scientists are the best examples how can a person get the best out of different hard situations, for example.
Yes, I see what I see on my side, because I'm surrounded by a lot of artists and creative thinkers, that they already have been struggling finding time for their creativity. So the pandemic didn't give them just more time to do sort of like doing hobbies or creative outlets that they haven't done before, but instead they were using creativity as a tool to dive deeper into what they've been doing, or able to look at something differently than the rest of us, right? Like uniquely. And yes. I'm just being very observant about this, because I see multiple variations of how people address it. And I'm just thinking, what I'm interested in this book about is how you collaborated together with your colleagues, but also the subject is very relevant today, because we can learn a lot from these thinkers who are not definitely following the general logic, but have a different path of approaching difficult situations. What have you learned from this, or what?
Just as you mentioned, that real creative person is very open towards new kind of ideas and approaches, and step out of the schemas and the regular things. And trying out some new ways is always very risky. So besides openness, they are risk takers as well. And risk taking is always involving anxiety, because you never know what you will come to. And that's why for these persons, the tolerate anxiety is one feature that is very basic. So I think that it's these kind of situations is very these times are very facilitating them to find this kind of new approaches within the things that they are doing. So as you mentioned, some of these creative persons haven't created something new or radically new things in their work actually, but they got some ideas how to solve actual problems or conflicts more successfully, and that's why I think that this kind of creativity is a protective factor in this kind of situations, and to find some new ways and taking the risk and something and things.
Is
like
it
this.
protective for the individual?
Yes, for the individual, I think so. And also, if the person is influential to the environment or to the social context, it can be beneficial for a lot of other people, not only for the individual.
I also noticed that when pandemic started, my attention was more on the past, because for artists who've been researching, working in the digital space already, we already have wealth of information of artists and scientists working or in other fields, working and using the online platforms, and so it wasn't as much of a shock. So in that moment, it was easier to access what was already done before, right? But then often I see that these approaches are not necessarily taken seriously, because in the past these were not mandatory. These were options, right? And even my work, many of my work in the past that relates to online or digital, they were more experimental, poking around questions, unfolding little nooks and details, but not necessarily trying to solve a problem. And when situations like this happen, then you find a function for it, you find purpose for it. And but now what I see in our world is not what I call it the digital Stone Age.
Digital
Stone Age.
Stone Age,
Yes, because there are a lot of people who have detailed experience and knowledge about the digital solutions and approaches, and then there are people who are open to it but don't have the experience, and then we have and I'm just simplifying this, and then we have a group of people and institutions and who are either opposed to it or not ready for all this technological nonsense, right? And so there's a battle between how to apply these approaches and where to best plant the seeds for different new methods that can use this technology. And of course, there's also another group of people and institutions who jump on technology, and suddenly everything is about digital and all these innovations and profit and all that. So there are all these groups, and now I'm just thinking about the makeup of the mindsets in these groups. They absolutely know, and sort of like traditional, which is where I'm coming from. My art used to be very traditional, and I'm only doing digital because I recognize the threat of the digital, and was interested in this interplay between the two. And then the extreme is the opposite of the traditional, where they go full force and sort of rush into digital solutions without collaborating with the traditional. What are your thoughts about that?
I'm also coming from very traditional contents, and in the beginning of this kind of new approach, I feel a huge resistance. So when the university told us that this is the new system called the Microsoft Teams, and you can find some instructions how to use it, for days or weeks I try to keep myself away, because I do not want to burden myself with these kind of institutions, and I have never been a technology junkie or something. So at first I couldn't imagine how will I do it, and I wanted to avoid this. First, I used Facebook groups because I'm very used to Facebook, and I wanted to find the easier way. And I made some Facebook groups for my with my students, and started to give lectures, but it was not that good because it was not too interactive. So in the end, I forced myself to start to use this Microsoft Teams, and in the end, I got into it, and I think that it was very useful. So for me, it was also a chance for development, and I did not regret it. And I think that we can find a fine golden path between the extremities by using this technology, but to save or to keep up using this kind of good old stuff as well. So, and also this kind of technology, as I mentioned you, or as we discussed before, it also help us to develop in the traditional ways, like being more personal and giving each other much more time. And we not suppose that the technology will solve the problems itself without us. It is only a surface or only a channel that we can use, and that's how.
Yes, I noticed there's much more self-reflection. So the space is, while we were so worried about stealing our identity and our connections, it's somewhat flipped. And what I see is people spend more time cooking and doing like more traditional things, and actually enjoying and being in the moment. While a year ago, we still had apps that were teaching us how to be in the moment. You know, we needed like technological tools to be in the moment instead of just being in the moment. So I'm hoping, and what I'm seeing is that the over saturation of technology will help us connect back to meaning and actual connection. So we will be able to separate this as a tool and create meaning. That's what my hope is. And I'm just thinking now about because schools will be opening up, and they call it the new normal. How do you go into the new path? What's your...
Actually, I don't know, because as I mentioned you formally, that from September I'm going on a special sabbatical, and I'm trying to create something new and find new topics, because in the recent years I started to be a kind of how to say it, self-repeating, always dealing with the same topics, always dealing with the same things. And I have been teaching in higher education for 20 years now, constantly, and I think I need a break. So
perfect time for a break then.
Yes, and I will keep up observing what's happening, so I'm not losing touch with reality at all. But I will. But I really hope that when my sabbatical will be over in next February, the regular forms of education will return, at least partly, because although we can be very happy that this crisis happened in the time when the internet and the online technologies that kind of developed, but because imagine that what would have happened if it was 20 years ago and not now. What could we do? Nothing at all. So I really hope that some kind of regular and traditional forms will return, because in my field, the personal presence is very important in therapy or consultation, and in teaching as well. So I think that there might be some fields when the online presence is enough for almost everything, but I think that psychology is another thing. And that's why I'm very open to do collaborations and kind of working together. For example, people from different countries can meet at the same time in a Zoom conference or something, and it's very good. But in regular situations, when I go into the university classroom and discuss a case, for example, with the students, it really requires the intimacy of a group being together, and I really miss it. And I really hope that when I return to university, it will be available.
And what if, because we don't know what the future is, right? What if this is just the beginning?
The beginning of
this new norm of a lot of technology.
We have to adapt to this, because I do not want to change my job. And if that's the way, I will do it. But for example, I do not want to make my own home an office, because it has to be separated. Because, for example, for me, it's very important to go home after work. But
and that's what's been taken away from both students and so it's everything melting into each other. And also time. I feel what's psychologically has been very big effect on people, and if we have to move forward with this, is the space, the confined space, and the time. Not having.
It's also very hard to manage the time, because what I felt that the working time in a week was expanding for me, because as I mentioned you, formerly my office hour was 90 minutes in a month, in a week, but now it was divided into separate periods. And in the end, I found that I had been working constantly from Monday to Friday, although regularly I don't work on Mondays and Fridays because it needs me to, I needed to keep myself fresh. So it was expanding, and for example, between the classes and the consultations, there were some free time, like 1 or 2 hours, but it was not a refreshing because you were stressed and you were ready for it, and so on. So it was absolutely not about refreshment and taking a rest, but constantly being in a stressful condition, and it's very exhausting, I think.
Yes.
So.
And also I noticed that just the sense of time, like I ended up not knowing what day it was, and therefore I was always working. Every morning was sort of a new task, or the continuing the previous. So there was no separation between.
Yes, and also my experience was that time flew very quickly. For example, I started doing classes, consultation, and therapies 9 o'clock in the morning, and at 6 o'clock in the evening, I realized, oh my God, the whole day went on, and I cannot really recall what really happened. And so it was a very different and new sense of time, but I wouldn't say that in the best way.
So you think because I'm just looking at my notes from your original lecture, which was right at the beginning of the pandemic, and you were talking about sort of this border situation where you have to stop and pause and really think about what's happening and take sort of a path of either slowing down or being creative in all options. But now what's next, right? So we phasing out from this moment of like crisis, which was like an immediate action, immediate response, and now we're looking back, trying to reevaluate the responses, and also looking forward, like what's happening, what's
What is very important actually is just to try to avoid burnout, because if I think that the crisis had a peak, and after that it goes down, but if it remains and we couldn't get back to our regular way of living, it might cause out us be feeling burnout emotionally, and we do not have enough sources to carry on. And I don't know that how it will happen, because if somebody said, or a lot of people said, that the second wave of the pandemic will come in the autumn, and we cannot be sure if there's gonna be a vaccine for it or not, because there are some viruses in the world that do not have a vaccine for, although they have been known for decades. So I think that this is maybe the worst period for that, because we do not know the long-term effects, and we do not know that what are the things that we had adapted to. Although this period that I mentioned in this lecture that you mentioned, the first facing with the limit situations, with all the bad and the good sides of it, is already gone. So I think that if you took a look at what people did in the first period of the pandemic, there were a lot of new, fresh and creative ideas appeared, and people found new ways of being together, and so on and so on. But this was only temporarily, and now I think we face a much more exhausting period if we cannot return to our regular activity, at least partly.
Mm-hmm. So no, it's not very often. I mentioned like looking back in the past and just history and just sort of like thinking about these patterns. It's this kind of crisis has happened in the past, and scientists research the pattern, but it's very rare that actually something where the crisis passed and you sort of like keeping your eye on looking forward that it might be coming back, right? So it's not like straightforward looking forward to a new life or leaving it in the past, but also keeping the possibility of the repeat of this, and had to be prepared for it, had to, I like you mentioned sort of like this period is sort of like the recovering period to really like pay attention to the self and recovering, and then to be prepared for whatever is coming.
So I think that actually we are not aware of that. What are the things that we have to let go or have to face that we will or we cannot carry on. For example, in the recent years, for example, tourism was very high and there were cheap flights to everywhere, and it became the part of a lot of people's life. And maybe this will not return to our lives, but still everyone has a high hope about returning to this kind of tourism because it gave aim and meaning and joy to a lot of people. And if we actually we don't know if we have to let it go or we have to grieve it or something, that we lost it or not. And but if we will be sure about that, maybe it will be much easier. Because
so it's kind of like a limbo right now, right? You mentioned like we're not sure if we need to grieve it. We know the possibility of losing it and needing to grieve it, so it's like a slow grieving.
Yes, because if we are aware of a loss now, that we can start grieving and we know that somehow in the end it will over. But if we do not know anything about it, we cannot start grieving, and it's a total phases of uncertainty, and that is what can cause burnout and exhausting much more than the real grief.
Okay, I see. So it's sort of this in-between space, this liminal space of limbo is the exhausting.
Yeah, I think so.
You don't know how to act, or you sort of
how
like
to adapt,
preparing for multiple options to be safe. That's interesting. So it's the anxiety of if we should be anxiety.
Yes.
Great. And so do you think these experiences will affect the new year that you're headed, because you said you will be going on sabbatical?
Yes.
Working on.
Yes, I really think, because it's no surprise that I will be dealing with existential psychology, because the university let me go to sabbatical if I do something for them, and I will write a textbook for them in this subject, because we have this kind of course, but it's a rather fresh course. We introduced it with one of my younger colleagues, and we do not have a textbook for it, or something
So
to
that's
learn
nice.
from.
You will have a formal textbooks for
Yes,
the class.
I will write. Yes. And I think that this kind of mood that we are in, it will really affect or influence the existential approach, and to go deep into the meaning of anxiety and freedom and these kind of typical existential things.
Will be very timely. And I hope you will publish it in English also.
The other thing that I would like to do, that I have a lot of articles in English that were published in the form or in the recent years, and maybe I will put together an English book and try to find some publisher for that. So this is my other plan for the next for this year.
And can you you mentioned this before, how would you structure your what you've been specializing in your career? Because existential psychology is the latest part of your research, right? How was it before? How did you structure? You mentioned that psychobiography was the previous
I
one,
think that
right?
the topics are coming from each other, so they are related to each. So I first studied literature, then I became a psychologist, and by studying creativity was a kind of intersection of this. And after that, and of course it was psychoanalytic approach that was proper. And by working on this topic, I had to realize that I need a method. And that's how a method for research, because I couldn't do it only on a theoretical level, but I needed something new and something more personal. And that's how psychobiography as a method came into view. And after that, when I realized about and started to use it, I began to show interest towards the basis of the method, like phenomenology and hermeneutics. And also it made me realize that it needs an ontological background. What do we know about humans, or what is man like? So we need a complex picture of human, and that's how existential psychology came into view. Because I think that in psychobiography we are not taking a look at person as a clinical case, but a person in existential context, looking for meaning, fighting with anxiety and freedom, and so on and so on. So this is one important basis for these kind of researches. And that's how these topics came one after the other, and forming a network for.
So I see a lot of collaborative outreach and interconnectedness in with other fields. So psychobiography doesn't stand on its own, but it has all these foundational connections.
Yes, of course.
Right? And it just to me it looks very rich environment for students also, because it's not theory oriented, as you said, but it's practically looking at this situation of our existence. And I'm also thinking about psychohistorical approaches. Is it also connected, or how?
Yes, it's there are some, of course, because psychohistory is not focusing on individuals, but on periods or or groups or nations or historical processes or events. And so psychobiography can be a part of a psychohistorical research. And also if you take a psychobiographical research and you draw conclusions about this era that the person lived in, it is going to be, or it is going to develop into a psychohistorical research.
So when you really talking about one person in the bio in the existence, you're also giving a cross section of the time, society, and all, like all the, because a person doesn't exist without all the connections to these environments and conditions. It's very interesting. And how about science? How is science connected?
Science?
Science in terms of, well, not, I'm thinking about more of the mathematical, analytical visualization of data. How, because many things that you're talking about is not necessarily quantifiable, right?
Not, yes, it's qualitative. In psychology, there are different traditions. There is, of course, a natural scientific psychology using this kind of biological approach and models, and also this statistics and so on and so on. But it is mostly related to academic psychology and empirical research. But there is another tradition that we call human science psychology that is more related to clinical and case study method, and also philosophical traditions, and that's what I'm more into. So I'm not too good in this kind of natural scientific approaches, because that is very different from my own interest. Yes.
Very different. I noticed that also, that there's a big divide, and I was just curious if there's any chance of connection.
There might be some, because I think that you can, if you do a psychobiography, you can include some quantitative parts into it. For example, like if you collect a lot of psychobiographical researches, you can draw a conclusion or see some patterns that can be justified or can be proved with statistical methods or something. And I think that currently there is a trend of using mixed methods in researches. For example, I think that this kind of human scientific approach can be, for example, in the first period of the research, like doing qualitative research with interviews and focus groups or something. And after that, you formulate some hypothesis and test it with quantitative methods. And I really think that, for example, a psychobiography can be a very good qualitative method in the first period of the research for formulating hypotheses that you can later test with quantitative methods.
Yes, I noticed that these mixed hybrid methodologies are very popular these days, and I'm a big support of that, because nothing, as we were talking about the individual, it doesn't exist without it's like an intersection, right, of that current time. They don't exist outside of the time and conditions. Just same as the scientific methods don't exist outside of their time. they are taking a position of today, looking at it today from their perspective, just like you're doing the same from from Hungary, right? But it's interesting because now the different geographical location or cultural locations are also sort of washing away because we are so like globally so connected through Zoom and everything. And that's also one of the benefit for me because I was able to invite you and connect and close the gaps between. So it's really good. Well, do you have any other things to mention? Because I think we've been talking about this for a while, and I don't know if I missed anything that you might have.
I think, for example, we could talk a lot about the ecological things because I'm also very interested in topics like ecological anxiety and ecological grief, and I'm also participating a lot of programs like this in Hungary related to Greenpeace, for example, and Extinction Rebellion. But I think that it can be a part of another conversation because
What time is it? Is it almost 7 for you? 7 p.m.?
Yes.
Yes, and I welcome that conversation because I do think it relates. It's very much related to the crisis that we have are going through or fading out from or trying to solve because it's all related to our mindsets also, like how we approach. So,
yes, and I think that this current pandemic is somehow covered the very actual and urgent question of climate change. But I really hope that after the pandemic is moving away, the climate problem will be much more will be in focus again, just as it was in 2019, for example, which was a huge breaking point for climate and ecological questions.
Actually, that brings me to one question that I forgot to ask is the misbelief, like how this sort of relates to this pandemic and the chance that this will happen. It's not new, but there was a lot of misbelief that, and obviously it's a complex question with the current situation, how much effort goes into the preventative measures from higher up supporting all the initiatives in the green movement and preventing and fixing things, right? But there are a lot of misbelief and not wanting to take the warning signs. This resistance, you mentioned resistance before.
So you think that this might help us to fight against misbeliefs?
I think so. And maybe that's where the quantitative science can come in handy, where a lot of misbelief is based on the qualitative research is not always enough for people to
But there is also a lot of irrational aspects of misbeliefs. So I think, and in the middle of these misbeliefs are, of course, the anxiety and the defense against anxiety. So most of the time people are denying reality, not because they feel that they do not have enough proof or enough data, but just because to accept reality would force them to face with the deepest anxieties that they have about lives and themselves, and it is much harder to change it or to cope with this kind of anxiety, and it's much easier to deny these aspects of reality than to face with finitude or on any kind of very hard topics in lives. And I think that existential approaches can be very helpful, because if we are starting to deal with these very deep and very hard questions in life, like facing finitude and meaningless and isolation, we are starting to be more conscious about these things, and following this, we will not need to use this huge amount of denial against reality.
Because that's more energy, right?
Yes.
We talked about, you mentioned that
And if we deny, we cannot find creative solutions to things. So it is related to each other. We are fearing death and finitude. That's why we are developing defenses against them, and everything that reminds us on the anxiety that we have defenses against, we will deny. And just as we deny reality, we cannot form new creative ideas about how to cope with the reality that changed according to climate change. So if you can understand how these are related to each other.
Yes, and I sort of see that in institutions and organizations also, that from the fear of losing either supporters, profit, location,
Yes.
the denial process is also there.
Yes.
It takes up a lot of effort and energy instead of just really sit and creatively address fundamentals to start building what we can do, right? That's interesting. And also, just as you said this, it occurred to me that it is a big solid triangle between the science and education, in my case, and psychology. Because if we understand the makeup of these changes, of how we react, then we can address these early on and consciously work with it instead of against it, right?
Yes.
Instead of wasting time and energy. Yeah, it's very complex.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what's nice about this complexity and current time is everybody's feeling it. So probably less explanation needed to spell out what we all already know. The experience. So hopefully the change can be built on this shared knowledge, which is also like the universal, like what's been helpful in any societies. There's always like in Hungary we call a school általános iskola, which is common knowledge school for the base knowledge, right? Like where you share knowledge together, then you can work together better, which is now in this global situation, we share a lot of this, a lot of the details. Great, so should we wrap up and continue next time on the on the global ecologic topic?
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, okay.
Thank you so much. This is very helpful, and thank you for sharing your perspective.
Glad to hear it.
On as an expert in the field, but also as an educator, right? Because now we are addressing all levels of our experiences.
Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you so much. Appreciate you.